Why Iran and Israel are enemies. The real history explained. They were never supposed to be enemies. For nearly 3 decades, Iran and Israel operated as quiet strategic partners, sharing intelligence, conducting joint military training, and building economic ties that neither government was eager to publicize. Iranian oil flowed into Israeli refineries. Israeli weapons technology found its way into Iranian arsenals. The relationship was discreet, transactional, and, by the cold logic of regional geopolitics, entirely rational. Then, in the span of a single year, it collapsed entirely. Today, Iran and Israel stand at the edge of open war. Iranian missiles have struck Israeli territory directly. Israeli strikes have targeted Iranian soil. Proxy forces armed, funded, and directed by Tehran have fired tens of thousands of rockets at Israeli cities. And Iranian Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei has repeatedly called for the elimination of the Israeli state, not as political rhetoric, but as official government doctrine. How did 2 countries that once collaborated so closely arrive at this point? The answer is not simple. It is not reducible to religion or ethnicity or ancient grievance. The real story is messier, more political, and far more instructive than most headlines allow. It is a story about revolution, ideology, and the brutal mathematics of regional power. It is about what happens when a government is overthrown and the country that replaces it decides that erasing a neighboring state is a founding principle of its national identity. This is not a conflict that was inevitable. It was constructed and deliberately, strategically, and with enormous consequences for the entire world. Understanding why Iran and Israel became enemies requires going back further than 1979. It requires understanding what the Middle East looked like before the Islamic Revolution, who held power, who was threatened by that power, and why the Shah of Iran and the State of Israel found themselves quietly and carefully on the same side. Because once you understand what they were, you begin to understand just how dramatic and how deliberate the transformation truly was. The stakes of this history are not academic. Iran's nuclear program now sits at a threshold that Israeli officials describe as existential. Iranian-backed militias operate on 3 of Israel's borders, and every diplomatic miscalculation, every military strike, every intercepted weapons shipment carries with it the risk of igniting a regional war that could draw in the United States, destabilize global oil markets, and reshape the balance of power across the entire Middle East. This is the story of how 2 countries went from partners to enemies, and why the consequences of that transformation are still being felt today. If this kind of deep dive geopolitical analysis is what you're looking for, subscribe now. New documentaries go live every week, and this story is only getting started. To understand the depth of the rupture between Iran and Israel, you have to understand what existed before it. In 1948, when Israel declared independence and immediately faced invasion from Arab states on all sides, Iran's response was notably restrained. Iran did not join the Arab coalition. It did not send troops. And in 1950, Iran became only the 2nd Muslim-majority country in the world, after Turkey, to formally recognize the State of Israel. This was not an accident. It was strategic calculation. Iran, under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, operated according to a doctrine known informally as the periphery strategy, a concept actively encouraged by Israel itself. The logic was straightforward. The Arab states of the Middle East were the primary threat to both Israel and to Iran's regional ambitions. Egypt, Syria, and Iraq were hostile to Israel and suspicious of Iranian power. That shared adversary created the foundation for a working relationship. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, that relationship deepened quietly. Israel's foreign intelligence service, Mossad, worked alongside Savak, the Shah's feared internal security apparatus, sharing training, methodology, and in some cases, operational intelligence. Iranian oil, which Israel desperately needed given Arab embargo threats, moved through back channels to Israeli ports. Israeli agricultural and technical expertise helped develop parts of the Iranian economy. It was never a warm alliance. There were no public state visits, no joint press conferences, no formal treaties. Both governments understood that visible cooperation would inflame Arab opinion and complicate Iran's standing in the wider Muslim world. But beneath the surface, the partnership was real, functional, and mutually beneficial. Then came 1979. The Iranian Revolution did not arrive without warning signs, but its speed and totality shocked nearly every government in the world, including Israel. In January of that year, Shah Pahlavi fled Iran under pressure from a mass popular uprising. By February, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had returned from exile in Paris and assumed control of the country. What followed was not simply a change of government. It was an ideological transformation of the Iranian state itself. Khomeini's revolutionary doctrine was built on several interlocking pillars: opposition to Western imperialism, rejection of monarchical governance, and the export of Islamic revolution across the Muslim world. Within that framework, Israel occupied a specific and permanent role. It was not simply a rival state or a geopolitical competitor. It was, in Khomeini's formulation, an illegitimate entity, a colonial imposition on Muslim land that had no right to exist. Within weeks of the revolution, the Israeli diplomatic mission in Tehran was handed over to the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Iranian government severed all official ties with Israel. Oil shipments stopped, intelligence cooperation ended, and the rhetoric that replaced the relationship was unlike anything in conventional interstate rivalry. Khomeini introduced the term that would define Iranian state language toward Israel for the next 4 decades. He called Israel a cancer, something to be excised, not negotiated with. That framing was not incidental. It was load-bearing ideology, woven into the foundation of the Islamic Republic itself. By the early 1980s, as Iran fought a brutal 8-year war against Saddam Hussein's Iraq, the new government was simultaneously beginning to build the infrastructure of what would become its most powerful geopolitical tool, a network of armed proxy forces stretching across the Middle East, pointed in significant part directly at Israel. The transformation was complete. The partner had become the declared enemy. The ideological rupture of 1979 was just the beginning. What followed over the next 4 decades was the systematic construction of a conflict, built layer by layer, proxy by proxy, strike by strike, until the hostility between Iran and Israel was no longer rhetorical. It was operational. To understand how that happened, you have to trace the specific mechanisms through which ideology became military reality. The first and most consequential of those mechanisms was Hezbollah. In 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in an effort to destroy PLO infrastructure operating from Lebanese territory. Iran saw an opportunity. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, the IRGC, deployed operatives into Lebanon's Bekaa Valley and began organizing, training, and funding a new militant force drawn from Lebanon's Shia Muslim population. That organization would become Hezbollah, the Party of God. From Israel's perspective, Hezbollah represented something categorically different from previous threats. It was not a stateless militant group operating opportunistically. It was a precision instrument designed, funded, and directed by a foreign government with a declared interest in Israel's destruction. Iranian money built Hezbollah's tunnels. Iranian weapons filled Hezbollah's arsenals. Iranian commanders sat in Hezbollah's planning rooms. By the 2006 Lebanon war, Hezbollah had accumulated an estimated 50,000 rockets aimed at northern Israel, more than many standing national armies. The war ended inconclusively, but its lesson was unmistakable. Iran had successfully placed a heavily armed military force on Israel's northern border without ever deploying a single Iranian soldier onto Israeli soil. The military implications are severe. Israel's air defense systems, among the most advanced in the world, were designed to handle threats from 1 or 2 directions at a time. Simultaneous coordinated attacks from 4 or 5 directions stress those systems in ways that no single adversary could achieve alone. Iran understands this. The proxy architecture is not just ideological solidarity with Palestinian or Lebanese causes. It is a force multiplication strategy. Then there is the nuclear dimension. And here the strategic stakes reach their highest and most dangerous point. Iran's nuclear program has been a central axis of the Iran-Israel conflict for more than 2 decades. Israel has maintained consistently and across multiple governments that a nuclear-armed Iran represents an existential threat, not merely a strategic disadvantage, but a potential civilizational danger to the Jewish state. Israeli officials have repeatedly stated that they will not permit Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon and that military action to prevent such an outcome remains permanently on the table. Iran insists its nuclear program is civilian in nature, oriented toward energy production and medical research. The International Atomic Energy Agency has documented, however, that Iran has enriched uranium to levels that have no civilian application, approaching weapons-grade purity. As of late 2024, assessments from multiple Western intelligence services concluded that Iran possessed enough enriched material that, if it chose to proceed, it could produce sufficient fissile material for a nuclear device within weeks. That window, narrow, contested, and closing, is what drives the most urgent calculations on both sides. For Israel, the strategic imperative is clear. Prevent Iran from crossing that threshold before it becomes irreversible. For Iran, the nuclear program represents both a deterrent and a bargaining chip, leverage that gains value precisely because it remains ambiguous. The entire conflict, viewed through this lens, is not simply about history or ideology. It is about which side blinks first in a standoff where the consequences of miscalculation are measured not in diplomatic setbacks, but in the potential for catastrophic regional war. When governments speak about the Iran-Israel conflict, they speak in the language of official position, carefully worded, strategically calibrated, and rarely complete. To understand what is actually happening beneath the surface of public statements, you have to turn to the analytical community, the intelligence assessors, the Security Institute researchers, the military strategists who spend their careers mapping the architecture of this rivalry without the constraints of diplomatic protocol. What they say is sobering. Intelligence community assessments from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Israel have converged on a consistent picture over the past several years. Iran has pursued a strategy of deliberate, calibrated escalation, pushing the boundaries of confrontation incrementally, testing Israeli and American red lines without crossing them so dramatically as to trigger a full military response. The April 2024 direct missile strike on Israeli territory was, in this analytical framework, not an eruption of uncontrolled aggression. It was a calculated signal, a demonstration of capability designed to reestablish deterrence after a series of Israeli strikes inside Iranian territory. Analysts at the International Institute for Strategic Studies have noted that Iran's strategic behavior follows a consistent pattern: absorb covert pressure, respond asymmetrically through proxies, and reserve direct action for moments when inaction would undermine the credibility of its deterrence posture. The 2024 strike fit that pattern precisely. Former CIA analysts with deep experience in Middle Eastern operations have described Iran's regional strategy as remarkably coherent over a 40-year time frame, more coherent, some argue, than Western policy toward the region over the same period. The proxy network was not built quickly or opportunistically. It was constructed through sustained investment, patient relationship building, and a willingness to absorb significant economic costs, including years of international sanctions, in order to maintain strategic depth. From the Israeli analytical community, the assessment is equally clear and considerably more alarmed. Researchers at the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv have consistently argued that Israel is facing a strategic environment without modern precedent. A hostile state actor with nuclear ambitions, a continental-scale proxy network, and an ideological framework that explicitly rejects the legitimacy of Israel's existence. Unlike conventional interstate rivalries, where both parties theoretically accept the other's right to exist and seek advantage within that framework, the Iran-Israel conflict is structurally asymmetric in its foundational assumptions. Israel seeks security within a recognized regional order. Iran, at the level of official state doctrine, seeks the dismantlement of that order. Military analysts who have studied the October 7, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel have drawn direct lines between Iranian strategic direction and the operational planning of that assault. While the precise degree of Iranian foreknowledge remains a subject of genuine analytical debate, assessments from multiple intelligence services suggest that Iranian funding, weapons supply, and long-term military training of Hamas were integral to the capabilities that made the attack possible. The scale of the tunnel infrastructure, the sophistication of the assault planning, and the quality of the weaponry involved all point toward sustained external investment over years. Academic researchers in the field of nuclear proliferation have raised perhaps the most structurally important warning of all. Experts at institutions, including the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Belfer Center at Harvard, have documented what they describe as a fundamental instability in the current deterrence architecture between Iran and Israel. Unlike the Cold War deterrence model between the United States and the Soviet Union, where both sides possessed nuclear weapons, both sides knew it, and both sides had communication channels robust enough to manage crises, the Iran-Israel dynamic is characterized by opacity, asymmetry, and the near-total absence of direct communication. There is no hotline between Jerusalem and Tehran. There is no crisis management protocol. There is no agreed framework for de-escalation. In the deterrence literature, that combination of factors, opacity, asymmetry, and absent communication infrastructure, is precisely the environment most conducive to catastrophic miscalculation. Analysts warn that the most dangerous moment in this conflict may not be a deliberate decision by either government to go to war. It may be a misread signal, a strike that lands harder than intended, or a proxy action that triggers a response neither side intended to escalate, but neither side knows how to stop. But the other side has a point, and in a conflict this complex, this layered with historical grievance and competing national narratives, intellectual honesty demands that we sit with that uncomfortable reality for a moment. The dominant Western framework for understanding the Iran-Israel conflict tends to follow a relatively clean moral and strategic logic. Iran is the aggressor, Israel is the defender, and the hostility flows primarily in one direction, from a revolutionary theocracy that has chosen enmity as a founding principle of its national identity. That framework is not without factual foundation, but it is incomplete. And its incompleteness matters because incomplete analysis produces failed policy. Begin with the Iranian domestic perspective. When Iranian officials describe their country's regional posture as defensive, they are not simply manufacturing propaganda for internal consumption. They are articulating a worldview that has genuine historical grounding, one that a significant portion of the Iranian population, regardless of their feelings about the Islamic Republic itself, finds at least partially persuasive. Iran fought a devastating 8-year war against Iraq between 1980 and 1988. A war in which Saddam Hussein's forces used chemical weapons against Iranian soldiers and civilians. Western governments, including the United States, were broadly aware of those chemical attacks and continued to support Iraq regardless. Approximately 500,000 Iranians died in that conflict. The collective trauma of that war shaped Iranian strategic culture in ways that outside analysts frequently underestimate. From that historical vantage point, Iran's pursuit of regional influence, through proxy forces, through nuclear ambiguity, through asymmetric military capability, looks less like ideological aggression and more like the rational behavior of a country that learned at enormous cost that it cannot rely on international norms or external guarantors for its security. It must build its own deterrence. It must create its own strategic depth. Several prominent international relations scholars, including analysts who are deeply critical of the Islamic Republic's human rights record and domestic governance, have argued that Western policy has consistently failed to grapple seriously with this dimension of Iranian strategic behavior. Sanctioning Iran without offering credible diplomatic off-ramps, they argue, does not moderate Iranian behavior. It reinforces the internal logic that drove Iran toward maximum deterrence in the first place. There's also a meaningful alternative interpretation of the nuclear question. The standard Israeli and Western position holds that Iranian nuclear ambitions are inherently destabilizing and must be stopped by any means necessary. But a number of serious strategic thinkers, including some within the American foreign policy establishment, have noted a structural irony at the center of that argument. Israel itself is widely understood to possess a nuclear arsenal of between 80 and 400 warheads, has never signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, and has never submitted to international inspection. This does not justify Iranian nuclear development, but it does complicate the moral and strategic architecture of the non-proliferation argument in a region where nuclear asymmetry already exists, and where Iran is acutely aware of that asymmetry. The alternative interpretation advanced by scholars of deterrence theory is that a nuclear-armed Iran might paradoxically produce a more stable regional order, one governed by mutual assured destruction rather than the current environment of ambiguous capability and perpetual preemptive temptation. That argument remains deeply controversial and is rejected by the overwhelming majority of Israeli strategic thinkers. But it exists within serious academic literature, and dismissing it entirely produces a less complete picture of the strategic landscape. Finally, there is the question of missed diplomatic opportunities. The 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in the Iran nuclear deal represented the most serious attempt in the post-revolutionary period to construct a negotiated framework capable of managing the nuclear dimension of this conflict. Iran agreed to significant constraints on its enrichment program in exchange for sanctions relief. International inspectors gained access to Iranian nuclear facilities at a level never previously achieved. In 2018, the United States withdrew from that agreement unilaterally. Iran subsequently accelerated its enrichment program to levels that far exceeded anything permitted under the original deal. Whether the withdrawal was strategically justified remains a matter of fierce debate. What is not debated is the outcome. The diplomatic architecture that had, however imperfectly, placed verifiable constraints on Iranian nuclear activity was dismantled, and the environment that replaced it is measurably more dangerous than the one that preceded it. The lesson is not that diplomacy always works. It is that the absence of diplomacy has consequences, and that those consequences are now embedded in the strategic reality that both Iran and Israel must navigate. It is tempting to view the Iran-Israel conflict as a regional story, a distant confrontation between two Middle Eastern governments whose grievances, however deep, belong to a geography far removed from the daily lives of most people watching this video. That temptation should be resisted. The consequences of this conflict are not contained by borders. They move through the global economy, through military alliance structures, through energy markets, and through the accelerating realignment of great power competition in ways that touch virtually every country on earth, including yours. Start with oil. The Middle East produces approximately 1/3 of the world's oil supply. Iran alone holds the 4th largest proven oil reserves on the planet. Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, and Iraq, all of whose production moves through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz, collectively represent an energy infrastructure whose disruption would send immediate shockwaves through every major economy in the world. Any serious military escalation between Iran and Israel that draws in American military forces, a scenario that multiple analysts consider plausible given existing U.S. defense commitments to Israel, carries with it a significant probability of Iranian action against Gulf energy infrastructure or against Hormuz transit itself. The last time oil markets faced a major supply disruption of that magnitude, prices surged to levels that accelerated inflation across the United States, Europe, and the developing world simultaneously. If that scenario materializes in a context where global inflation is already elevated and central banks have limited room to maneuver, the economic consequences could be severe and prolonged. Gasoline prices in the United States, fuel costs across Europe, and energy expenses throughout the developing world would all absorb that shock, not as an abstract market event, but as a direct pressure on household budgets, transportation costs, and the price of every good that moves through a supply chain. The military consequences extend well beyond the immediate theater of conflict. The United States maintains approximately 40,000 military personnel across the Middle East, in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, the UAE, and multiple other locations. In any serious Iran-Israel escalation, those forces become potential targets. Iranian-backed militia groups in Iraq and Syria have already demonstrated both the willingness and the capability to strike American military installations. They did so repeatedly between 2023 and 2024, launching hundreds of drone and rocket attacks against U.S. positions across the region. A broader escalation would place those forces under sustained threat, almost certainly require significant reinforcement, and force a set of American strategic choices that would reverberate through NATO alliance commitments, Indo-Pacific military posture, and the ongoing support architecture for Ukraine simultaneously. American military resources are not unlimited. Every commitment in one theater is a constraint in another. The geopolitical consequences reach further still. Russia has developed a working relationship with Iran that has deepened significantly since the beginning of the Ukraine war. Iranian drones have been used extensively by Russian forces on Ukrainian battlefields, creating a military-industrial linkage between Moscow and Tehran that gives Russia a direct stake in Iran's regional survival and strategic capacity. Any Western military action against Iran would be processed in Moscow not merely as a Middle Eastern event, but as a precedent, a demonstration of Western willingness to conduct regime-threatening military operations against a partner state. China, for its part, has invested heavily in Iranian energy infrastructure and signed a 25-year strategic cooperation agreement with Tehran in 2021. Beijing watches the Iran-Israel confrontation not with detachment but with calculation, assessing what it reveals about American deterrence credibility, alliance management, and the willingness of Western powers to sustain military commitments in multiple theaters simultaneously. For countries across the global south, many of which depend on Middle Eastern energy, maintain complex relationships with both Western powers and the Iran-Russia-China axis, and are already navigating the economic disruptions of a fragmenting global order, an Iran-Israel escalation represents one of the most destabilizing variables currently in play. And for ordinary people, we in Karachi and Cairo, in London and Los Angeles, in Jakarta and Johannesburg, the consequences arrive not as geopolitical abstractions, but as lived economic reality. Higher fuel prices, more expensive food, greater instability in the global systems that move goods, capital, and people across borders. The Iran-Israel conflict is not happening somewhere else. Its consequences are already here. And if the trajectory of the past 4 decades continues without a fundamental strategic disruption, they will intensify. We began this documentary with a question that most headlines never fully answer. Why are Iran and Israel enemies? The answer, as we have traced it across 8 decades of history, is not reducible to religion, ethnicity, or ancient hatred. It is the product of deliberate political choices made by specific governments at specific moments for specific strategic reasons, choices that compounded over time, calcified into ideology, and eventually constructed a confrontation so deeply institutionalized that neither side currently possesses a credible roadmap for walking it back. Let us take stock of what we know with certainty. Iran and Israel were functional strategic partners until 1979. The Islamic Revolution did not simply change Iran's government, it restructured the ideological foundation of the Iranian state in ways that made hostility toward Israel a core organizing principle, not a policy preference subject to revision. Over the 4 decades that followed, Iran built a regional proxy network of extraordinary sophistication: Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, Houthi forces, Iraqi militias, that placed military pressure on Israel from multiple directions simultaneously. Israel responded with a sustained covert campaign of strikes, sabotage, and targeted killings that has no real parallel in modern interstate conflict. And in April 2024, the shadow war finally broke into direct state-on-state military confrontation for the first time in history. What remains uncertain is equally significant. The precise degree of Iranian command and control over its proxy forces in any given operation remains analytically contested. The exact threshold at which Israeli strategic planners would authorize a preemptive strike on Iranian nuclear facilities and the precise timeline before Iranian enrichment becomes irreversible are unknowns that even the most well-resourced intelligence services are working with incomplete data to assess. And the question of whether any diplomatic framework capable of managing this conflict can be constructed, given the current state of U.S.-Iran relations, Israeli domestic politics, and Iranian internal power dynamics, remains genuinely open. Several developments in the coming months deserve close attention. Watch the status of Iranian nuclear enrichment. Any announcement from the International Atomic Energy Agency indicating further acceleration in enrichment levels, or any Iranian decision to expel IAEA inspectors, would represent a threshold moment that compresses Israeli decision timelines significantly. Watch the diplomatic posture of the United States toward Iran, particularly any signals regarding the possibility of renewed nuclear negotiations or, conversely, increased military coordination with Israel. Watch Hezbollah. The organization's calculus in Lebanon represents perhaps the most immediate near-term variable. Its decision about whether to escalate or restrain its military activity will shape the operational environment on Israel's most dangerous border. And watch the internal politics of Iran itself. A government managing severe economic pressure from sanctions, significant domestic discontent, and the death of key leadership figures is a government whose external behavior becomes harder to predict. 2 credible forward scenarios now present themselves. In the first scenario, escalation continues along its current trajectory. Iranian nuclear enrichment reaches a point that Israeli officials determine requires direct military action. Israel strikes Iranian nuclear facilities, potentially with American support, potentially unilaterally. Iran responds with a massive coordinated proxy assault from multiple fronts simultaneously, combined with direct missile strikes on Israeli territory. The United States is drawn into active military conflict. Gulf energy infrastructure is threatened. Global oil markets convulse. The Middle East enters a period of sustained military conflict whose endpoint and boundaries are impossible to define in advance. In the second scenario, a combination of back-channel diplomacy, mutual exhaustion, and great power pressure produces a fragile but functional de-escalation framework. Neither side achieves its maximum strategic objectives. Iran retains regional influence but accepts verifiable constraints on its nuclear program in exchange for sanctions relief. Israel accepts Iranian regional presence while securing guarantees, formal or informal, against direct military confrontation. The conflict does not resolve, it manages. It freezes into a tense, unstable equilibrium that neither side fully accepts, but both sides calculate is preferable to the alternative. History suggests that the second scenario is significantly harder to achieve than the first. The institutional momentum of this conflict, the proxy networks, the covert operations, the domestic political incentives on both sides that reward confrontation over compromise, all push in the direction of continued escalation rather than negotiated restraint. But history also reminds us that conflicts which appeared intractable have, at specific moments of political will and strategic necessity, found unexpected off-ramps. The question is whether the governments involved, and the great powers whose interests are embedded in this confrontation, possess the strategic vision and political courage to find one before the window closes entirely. That question does not yet have an answer. But it may be the most important geopolitical question of the coming decade. If this documentary gave you a clearer picture of one of the world's most consequential and misunderstood conflicts, subscribe now and share this video with someone who needs to understand what is actually at stake. New deep dive documentaries go live every week. The story is still unfolding, and when it does, you will want to be here.